As your thesis advisor, I have the privilege of going first with my questions.
Okay.
First of all, who do you think you are? I'm just kidding. First of all, maybe you can talk a little bit more about somebody who is not a Christian, looking at and really wanting this idea of unconditional love, wanting to grow, but maybe coming to you, I don't know, a friend of yours or something, and saying, but I don't know if I can buy this whole unconditional love. In what ways would you counsel them?
The way I would kind of counter that idea is that when we look at what happens when we suffer, it ultimately, great suffering puts us on a timer that we may only have so much time left here. And you need to prioritize what's going to be more important in your life. Are you going to focus on wallowing in your own misery? Or are you going to make that last bit of time count? And unconditional love is ultimately the best way to make that time count, because that's where relationships are founded. That's where we can connect with other people, that even in darkness, we always have someone to go to. So unconditional love is ultimately, for anyone suffering, it's the way to almost prioritize what's important in life, where your priorities are when your time is limited.
Awesome, good job. And I think you did a great job in your thesis on this next question. But is the role of faith, of religion, in the process of spiritual healing. What would you say to somebody who is maybe a secular psychologist, who is maybe very apprehensive about bleeding these two things together, who would want very separate categories, boundaries between the world of psychology and the world of religion? What would you say to them?
Well, I think that's ultimately a very hard distinction to make, because a lot of people who don't believe in God don't necessarily want to come to God and will reject this idea of merging the two. But the point is that science is only really possible because of God. And we can still study science if we don't believe in God. But when you have an understanding of God and faith in Him, science fits into Christianity. It bolsters Christianity. So on its own, like I talked about, psychotherapy can provide people healing. It's proven to be successful in giving people healing and hope. But I think the point that we need to make is that for those people who are Christian, for those people that do have faith in God, that merging their faith with a scientific understanding of the world God created is very powerful. Not everyone will accept that answer, especially a very secular psychologist like you talked about. But I think that's ultimately something that a Christian and a very, very secular psychologist who doesn't want to think about God at all ultimately might not ever be able to fully agree upon.
Awesome. Final question. You talk about hope, or the passage that you quoted talks about hope. There's spiritual hope and there's earthly hope, or something like this.
Yes.
What would you say to somebody who has hope because they're suffering, and yet that hope is the earthly hope that the thing that's causing their suffering goes away? Is that okay for them to hope for?
Well, I think part of that almost is an unconscious biblical hope. And to have biblical hope in an unconscious sense, you don't necessarily have to know the Bible, because biblical hope goes beyond an earthly hope. I forget what the Greek word is, but I learned about it today. The Greek word in Hebrews 11:1, I believe, that talks about biblical hope is a hope in things known to happen. It's almost a certainty. Whereas earthly hope is not necessarily certain. So if someone has that much trust in whatever it is that's giving them hope, most of the time it will be very earthly, but they may know to a certain extent that it will work. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn it over to each of the judges and then to the audience. I'm going to be the time guardian. So you get 4 minutes, and I will have to be the bad guy. The best thing to help Kai, I think, is to make sure that your questions are phrased in the form of a question and not an opinion. Okay, Sam, to you.
When looking into all of your research, I noticed that both in the paper and your speech, you talked about religion and then immediately came down on Christianity as the go-to thing. And I realized that, well, you're Christian, you're at a Christian school, you attend a church, so that's kind of straightforward. But did you look into any other religions and how they meshed with psychotherapy? Buddhism, perhaps, or Islam, anything along those lines?
Well, I think when we look at religion specifically, there's multiple different types. We can, talk about Islam, we can talk about Christianity. There's a whole bunch of different types. But when I was thinking of where I want my paper to go and what I think is important to this understanding of healing, I don't necessarily think other religions can fully grasp the way that Christianity finds healing based on God's love. There's no other religion that has a God that is willing to sacrifice himself for the people as Jesus did. So in that sense, I didn't really put as much into other religions, since Christianity kind of stands out as the sole religion that has that sacrificial love at its very center.
All right. Kind of going on that idea then, how would you convince people who are of other religions then that they might want to consider changing their mind amidst all of this?
Well, I think a lot of it almost comes down not necessarily talking to them too much. And of course, certain counseling and trying to persuade them is good. But if you try and persuade someone too much, it may only push them away, especially if they really don't want to be a Christian. They'll just push them away. So some of the best, I think one of the best things you can do in that situation is to just be the Christian, not be the guy who talks about Christians. Be the Christian. Be the one who centers your life around unconditional love, and be a living example of that. And sometimes just being a living, quiet example of that healing is better than any attempt at persuasion.
Okay. You mentioned in your paper and towards the conclusion that you called unconditional love something of a superpower, where it's like almost unachievable in nature. We compare other superpowers like the ability to stop time or something, and it seems ridiculous. So looking at it, do you believe that it's truly possible given the fallen nature of man?
Is it truly possible for everyone to center their lives around unconditional love?
Yeah, to ever truly reach that point, or will that just be an ongoing battle until
I think
the end?
That's going to be an ongoing battle because it's such a fallen world. We're never going to reach that point where 100% of the world population focuses on unconditional love. I wish we were able to, but in this fallen world, that's simply not a possibility. But I think then the point goes to, just because we can't reach 100 doesn't mean we can't get more people to love unconditionally. And kind of going on, similar to salvation, it's ultimately not up to us who's saved, it's up to God. But we can kind of be a beacon of God, shine his light out. We're not the ones making people center their lives around unconditional love, but we can be that example, and we can almost be kind of God's way of helping other people come to that. So no, we're not going to get 100%. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't work to get as many people as possible to center their lives around unconditional love.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Aloha, Kai.
Hello.
First, I really like your paper.
Thank you.
And I feel like you're pretty clear about your focus and your limitations in the introduction and all throughout the paper. You've been pointing that out in a pretty seamless way, and I like that. Now, in your conclusion, you mentioned about, let's take sentence. Psychotherapeutic Christianity is the best possible way to find PTG. Okay, let's unpack the term, psychotherapeutic Christianity. How is this term similar or different from, say, Christian counseling, or ideas purported already by Christian psychologists like Cloud and Townsend? Have you read books of them?
I haven't, but I get your question. And it's not different. The problem is not that this doesn't exist anywhere. It does exist some places. The problem is not enough people know about it. That not enough people know that when we want to find healing in a Christian sense, that doesn't mean we can't look into psychotherapy. That they work almost as steps on a ladder. That God created this whole world around us, and part of our healing can be found by looking into the science he created. So it's not an idea that's never been developed on before. It's not something brand new. I don't know if somebody's come up with the term psychotherapeutic Christianity before. But I think it's something that not enough people know about and not enough people focus on.
So your concept of psychotherapeutic Christianity is it similar to Christian counseling, or?
I would believe so. I don't know much about Christian counseling, but I do believe that it would be similar. That it's taking the Bible and our biblical faith and hope, but connecting it to the scientific world, knowing that there is a physical aspect, that there is a certain way our brains react to suffering, that is not something purely mental, that it is something that is both physical and mental, that there's a union between the two, that they work very closely together, and we can't always find full healing unless we look at both.
Okay, last question. So we're talking about unconditional love, earthly hope, other kinds. These are all abstract concepts. Now I want practicals. Say there's a Christian nonprofit and the goal is to serve or assist families impacted by disabilities. How are they going to apply psychotherapeutic Christianity? Do you have an idea?
Well, part of that would just be when they're working with these families to not only be like, okay, everything's going to be okay because the Bible says it's going to be okay. Because, yeah, everything will be okay, and we know that God's going to make everything better. But for most people, that's not a sufficient answer when they're in the midst of suffering. And so psychotherapeutic Christianity does not need to be something that psychologists implement, that you need to go to a specific person for. It's something that everyone can do, that when you're ministering to other people, that you're recognizing the link between science and unconditional love and helping people to, in a loving, forgiving, kind way, to be able to use those aspects of psychotherapy, of changing themselves, of helping them understand and realize their suffering in a biblical sense.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, Kai.
Hello.
You are remarkably passionate, informed, and articulate. So thank you so much for your presentation. I actually took a course on Christian counseling, and the book we used was called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, which I think is remarkably close to psychotherapeutic Christianity. And the premise was that you can't have unconditional love if you are emotionally wounded. That God created and brought the two together, and you have to understand both to be healthy. So it's very along the lines of what you said. So my question to you is, how do we, well, probably it's a corollary to your thesis, Professor, that wanted to know how psychologists would help accept this, but how do we have the church accept the psychological aspects, the importance of understanding emotional health?
I mean, I think the way of getting kind of the church, on the other hand, to accept the science section is just to kind of remind people that science and Christianity are not something separate. Within the last past few decades, people have really split the two. But when we look at what science is, what psychotherapy is, we can see that science is, one, only possible because God created it, but also that the two greatest scientific discoveries in science in general in the last century point to God, that the universe had a beginning and that it is finely tuned for life. So I think the way to get churches to accept that is to recognize that science and Christianity are not something separate, but something that ought to be together. A few centuries ago, I believe at the time of Isaac Newton, Christianity and science were very close together. And they researched the world in a Christian way. So I think the way to help the church kind of grasp onto this idea is to make sure that people know just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you can't believe in science. That there's not everything's perfect, but there's a lot of good stuff in science and a lot of good stuff in psychotherapy. And allowing people to accept that and adapt it in a biblical Christian sense.
Yeah, good. But I think you're right on target that the most focused thing is that unconditional love, that how we emulate the Lord in that way. So I'm going to ask you a question that I have no right asking you, but how do you think the church is doing right now? That's a hard one, isn't it?
I think it ultimately comes down to each individual church. Like I know my church, I'm a Catholic, the priest at my church is super good about talking about unconditional love being the primary aspect. He's incredibly inspiring, incredibly moving. But at the same time, there's a lot of churches that focus on politics much more than anything spiritual or anything focused on unconditional love. So I don't know if I can put a specific statistic or number on churches, but I think it's something that varies between every single church.
Yes, yes. And how can we help those who are not focused on unconditional love put their focus there?
I think
last question.
Part of it, do you mean like the congregation, normal people, or the
as a church community or as the big church of the Lord together, how can we make that?
A lot of that comes down almost to the church playing a central role. The church, like the church, you know what I mean? Like the elders in the church, the organization. And so it comes down because every denomination has like one overarching title. So we can say Presbyterian, we can say Anglican, we can say Catholic. And all of those have a little bit of centrality, that they all kind of have a central idea in relation to all the other churches that go under the same name. And I think the way to help churches as a whole is to make sure that everybody understands how important unconditional love is. It doesn't matter what your political preference is. It doesn't matter what politics or what science or anything like that. you focus on, because that's not ultimately the focus of Christianity. And I think kind of centering churches as a whole back on that idea, making sure that every single denomination knows that and centers on that would be incredibly helpful in bringing people to focus on unconditional love.
Very well said. Thank you so much. I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Your paper very much.
And now we open up to the members of the audience to give him questions, not to exceed 4 minutes. I don't know if we need the mic. Oh, that's fine. All right, maybe raise your hands and try to get started.
Yes.
Hi, first of all, well done.
Thank you.
I have never heard of PTG.
Yes.
Why do you think that's the case? I've heard a ton about PTSD.
Yeah.
Why do you think I've never heard that before you sharing it with us tonight?
Well, starting with PTSD is something we've known about for roughly a century, starting with shell shock in World War I. PTG, I don't know for sure, but I believe it's something relatively new. That we know about healing, we know about people kind of finding healing in different places, especially in Christianity and hope. And PTG is almost the first step and the first title for naming that correlation between healing and hope. And since PTSD is, even though it's kind of old, it's a century old, in the grand scheme of things, that's still relatively new, that understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we can see various people trying to talk about mentality, with some people very good at it, some people not so good at it. You can talk about Sigmund Freud or other people who have thought about the human psyche in different ways. And so a lot of thought has gone into it. Post-traumatic growth is almost the unified term for hope. And so I don't know how new it is, but I would believe it's relatively new. I didn't know about it until, I believe Dr. Holcomb told me about it at the beginning of this year. Yes.
What would you say to someone who has experienced trauma and they're in a city, maybe it's a military person who had a great loss, and they're not with family and they're not with friends, at least not close friends, and maybe they don't even have a church, and they go to counseling. Is that going to be enough for them?
I would
to
say,
be able to heal from that?
I would say it's a very case-by-case thing. So some people will find healing that, but I would assume most people wouldn't. And even when people do find some healing, there's oftentimes they can go into a form of relapse. It's never fully solved. And so I think in that sense, not necessarily. But when someone is that isolated, when they don't have their family around, when they don't have their friends around, when they've suffered great loss and they don't necessarily know God, that's going to be very difficult. And I think at that point, it's very hard to help someone until they're able to get out of that environment, to be able to find a church. So that's almost the point of psychotherapy, that when they go to that counseling, the psychotherapist has them change parts of their mentality, change parts of themselves to better adapt. And I think that's almost the first step. And once they start adapting, they'll start reconnecting with their family and friends. They might start going to a church. So it's almost like that adaptation that they gain is not full healing, but it's the first step on a path to find healing.
So your suggestion to them would be
to continue at it. That once they're working with that psychiatrist, once they're in that counseling, to not give up on it, not think that's the end of the line, but that it's something that they must continually work for. That when they are out of that situation, when they are out of the war zone, when they are, or if they're in a city back home, to find different ways to connect, to meet new people, to find a church, to not give up on it and not think that simply changing bits and pieces of yourself is enough. Yes.
Very well done.
Thank you.
This, just listening to your speech, this sounds like a very well-researched topic. And you just, listening to you, you just got me thinking. I'm wondering what item that you came across in your research interested you the most?
So in other words, you're asking, what's the most interesting thing I've learned?
Say that.
I have to say the most interesting thing I've learned would honestly be post-traumatic growth, like what Ms. Wilson was talking about. I didn't know about it before I started this speech. It's something that's relatively new to my understanding of it, and it's just something a lot of people haven't heard about. So knowing that there is actually development in this hunt for healing, that there is development, that people are creating terms for centralizing ideas of hope and healing under the same name, that was very incredible to learn about. That there's actually some headway in this research.
That is all the time. We have 4 questions.